Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any future video ideas for this channel, please comment them below.
The date is January of 1863. As the gales of winter drew upon the eastern shores of America and the savage war had begun to dim in the chill, President Abraham Lincoln began to face the uncertain reality of the future of his country. Nearly 2 years had passed since the first shots of the Civil War were fired, and yet still in the Eastern Theater, his army had made little progress. At such a desperate position, Lincoln resolved at length to entirely rearrange his army and his strategy. Up until then, his main objective had been to drive south and capture the Confederate capital at Richmond. But following the failure of 4 such campaigns, he had realized that his main target should be the Confederate Army and not its capital. Later in January, Lincoln appointed Union General Joseph Hooker, a rising officer who had proved his capability multiple times before, as the commander of the 130,000-strong Army of the Potomac. For most of the inactive winter months of 1863, Hooker conducted various reforms upon his demoralized army. As spring drew on, Hooker began developing a plan of attack, hoping to score a decisive victory against the Confederacy. Across the winding Rappahannock River lay the bulk of the Confederate Army, the 60,000-strong Army of Northern Virginia led by the illustrious General Robert Lee. The Confederates were encamped in defensive positions near the town of Fredericksburg, and though outnumbered 2 to 1, it would be difficult to defeat such a strong force while it was dug in. Hooker's plan involved having General George Stoneman cross the Rappahannock River further upstream with 10,000 cavalry, and raid Lee's supply lines in the heartland of Virginia. However, Stoneman was severely delayed as he attempted to cross the river upstream, forcing Hooker to change his plans. After discussing the matter with his officers, Hooker resolved to strike directly at Lee's army across the river. He planned to have half of his host ford the river a few miles upstream and concentrate near the hamlet of Chancellorsville, thus entirely flanking the Confederate army. At the same time, General John Sedgwick would cross the river further east near Fredericksburg with the rest of the Union host to directly confront the bulk of Lee's army. Then, with a general assault, the Confederate host would be crushed entirely between the 2 Union contingents. The vanguard of the Union Army began fording the Rappahannock River on April 27th, facing surprisingly meek resistance from the Confederates. By May 1st, Hooker had concentrated nearly 70,000 men around Chancellorsville, successfully rounding the Confederate left flank and threatening to crush the Southern Army between the 2 Union forces. The reason behind Lee's inaction during this period of time was mostly due to his own misinterpretation of his enemy's movements. It was not until April 30th that detailed reports reached him, and he realized the true objective of Hooker's maneuver. According to usual military tactics used at that time, Lee should have retreated at once, since he was flanked by an opponent twice his strength. But instead of retreating as Hooker expected, Lee decided to divide his army in 2, leading 50,000 soldiers westward to confront Hooker at Chancellorsville, leaving only 8,000 under General Jubal Early to attempt to defend Fredericksburg, which was being threatened by more than 35,000 Union soldiers. At dawn on May 1st, Major General Thomas Jackson, famously nicknamed Stonewall Jackson, departed Fredericksburg with his corps, marching west at the head of Lee's column. By 8 a.m., he had joined with the Confederate forces stationed near the boundaries of the Wilderness, a great mass of dense forest and hills which covered the entire western part of the battlefield. There, Jackson found the Confederate regiments already in defensive positions. However, as a general who preferred aggressive action, he ordered an advance at once on the Union lines, despite being outnumbered. The first shots of the battle were fired around noon, as Jackson's men collided with Union soldiers who had marched from Chancellorsville to answer the Confederate advance. Fierce battle soon broke out between the 2 forces, along 2 main roads leading out from Chancellorsville. Initially, the Confederate momentum pushed back their Union counterparts, but the arrival of reinforcements drove Jackson's forces back to where they had started. Well through noon they fought, with neither of them able to gain the upper hand of the other. As afternoon drew on, however, matters began looking grim for the Confederates. While Hooker had sent soldiers to face Jackson directly, he dispatched additional regiments along the river road to the north, aiming to round his enemy's right flank. Having made good progress, this contingent had already passed the Confederate line, and was in an excellent position to drive into the enemy's rear. At this excellent opportunity, however, Hooker inexplicably ordered a withdrawal, having all his regiments disengage and fall back to a defensive position in the wilderness in order to avoid heavy casualties. Yet faced with an opportunity to decisively defeat the Confederate army, this decision might have been a fatal mistake. The manner of Hooker's retreat was also questionable. He ordered his defensive line to be drawn out at the bottom of a row of hills, a crammed location for his massive numbers to be favorably deployed. In response to this order, one of his senior officers exclaimed, "My God, if we can't hold the top of the hill, we certainly can't hold the bottom of it." Catching his enemy on unfavorable terrain, the aggressive Stonewall Jackson concentrated nearly 40,000 Confederate soldiers on the hills facing the Union lines, preparing for an attack the following day. That night, however, as scouting reports began arriving, Jackson and Lee realized that there was a secret road which led deep into the wilderness, coming onto Hooker's line from the right. If they could lead part of their men along this road without being discovered, they would be in a favorable position to undertake a potent flanking maneuver. Without any further hesitation, Lee resolved to play another daring gamble and take advantage of the hidden road. On the morning of the following day, May 2nd, Jackson quietly set off on his 12-mile-long march with nearly his entire corps of 30,000 men, with only 10,000 remaining with Lee. These soldiers would attempt to deceive their enemies into thinking that the main Confederate army was still in place. To Lee, it was a great risk. His hopes for victory depended upon passive action of his enemy and outstanding performance for Jackson. The next few hours could rule the fate of his career and his army. For most of the morning and the early hours of the afternoon, the Union Army remained ignorant of the Confederate movements. Any reports from scouts were shrugged off as impossible or irrelevant by senior officers and did not even reach Hooker. Little did they know that the footsteps of doom were already approaching.